Thank you, Julia. Good morning, everybody. How's it going? What I do to my class? How's it going? There. All right. I'll tell my class I did that to you guys. First of all, I want to express my thanks to my co-authors on this presentation, as well as the upcoming manuscript here, DeSalle and Larkin. Both these gentlemen were instrumental in kind of moving forward the data. One thing I found out when you start working with some of the data that we'll talk about here today is you get a lot of it, and so it's kind of hard to organize, and they definitely helped me in that. Yeah, it's on. Okay. Oh, there we go. All right. Excellent. So I think we're aware that waterfowl are one of those groups of birds that do and can exhibit winter fidelity. And we're probably recognizing too that there's some real benefits to having that trait in terms of familiarity with feeding, predators, cover, the whole thing in terms of benefits, either to survival or reproduction. And there's also, when you're starting to look at fidelity, those implications about gene flow and population structure out there. And if you start looking at and examining fidelity in terms of conservation planning, it does really inform conservation planning in terms of populations, where you need to conserve habitats and how much. If you look in the literature, thanks Carl Mitchell for this citation, and Carl and co-author expressed that trumpeter swans, and I think we all recognize and probably kind of intuitively know that they have this high fidelity to areas. But really, when you start looking in the literature and trying to pin down some numbers, there's not a lot out there. And what we've seen with a lot of these restoration flocks is they kind of relatively sedentary. They haven't really built up those strong migration traditions potentially. And with that, trying to determine kind of the extent of immigration on those demographic processes is kind of relatively unknown. So for this study, what we were looking at are trumpeter swans in the Nebraska sandhills. Again, this is the high plains flock of the interior population. These birds in the 1960s, and they winter and breed in the sandhills. We do know the population
in progress
time, and but the genetic diversity of this population is low. Despite the sandhills, and I'll talk about them here in a little bit if you've never been there. This is a relatively, when you're talking landscape, relatively pristine area. But we're starting to see some real conservation threats starting to emerge. The big one, and kind of what the impetus behind this study was, is wind development in this area, and what that means in terms of power lines. But we're also seeing possible depletions of the groundwater, which are going to have some impacts on wintering habitat. And the trumpeter swan is a tier 2 species in the natural legacy plant of Nebraska, so it's a species of importance to Nebraska. We have not a lot of information about winter ecology of trumpeter swans in the sandhills. There's been a few studies, but not a lot out there. And again, basically, as the title suggested, this is kind of lines right with our objective, what we're trying to find out about these birds in the sandhills. And again, taking this information and then kind of giving it to the joint ventures, the Sandhills Task Force, other groups, that we can start doing a better job in terms of conservation planning. And we kind of, when we started this, we kind of figured, again, based on literature, we're going to see some pretty high fidelity, but kind of in relation to that, when you look at the habitats in the sandhills, it's very unique in terms of the juxtaposition of where these birds actually breed and their wintering habitats. They're right mixed together. So we were anticipating pretty high fidelity. So to give you a little context, This is where you're at right now and where you're talking, where the study is, and you can actually see kind of the outline of the sandhills in this vegetation right there. So again, drive about 8 hours east and you'll run right into it. And the sandhills again cover about maybe 15% of the state. And what you see here in kind of outlining, what you have within the sandhills are these streams and creeks and rivers that traverse right through all the breeding habitat where these birds are occurring. And again, the Creek Refuge, the sandhills don't stop at the border. They do go a little bit further north into South Dakota, but not very far. If you've never been there, the first thing I'll say is you need to get there. Again, this is some habitat that's relatively pristine when you think about the rest of Nebraska and what's happened. Corn and soybeans. This is kind of it is a unique area. You really need to get there. It is actually sand dunes. It's grass covered sand dunes. And what you have intermixed between some of the sand dunes are these big lakes out there. And actually right here, one of the birds that we talked about caught there, another one there, another one there. And again, intermixed, as I mentioned, are these streams, creeks, and rivers that actually are open throughout most of the winter. They're groundwater fed. And so they stay open through most of the winter, through most of the length of the time. And again, you have little oxbows, marsh areas off a lot of these that provide some pretty good foraging habitat, as long as those will freeze up and then they kind of go to the rivers. And what we did, and this is one of those things where I tell my students, this is one of these projects that you can't believe you're getting paid to do. But we got out there, Captain Swan using some airboats, got them in the airboat, took them back to land, started working them up in terms of bands, all the stuff you do normally in some of these projects. For most of the birds that we were trying to get, we were really trying to target adult females with cygnets. We didn't get that all the time, but that was kind of our goal, is to look at that category of bird. Again, we attached GPS collars to these. And one of the good things about the sandhills, we couldn't use GSM because of the cell tower coverage. And that's the other good thing about the sandhills. I can still get up there, get away from anybody and say, well, I'm in the sandhill, I can't get coverage. And you're not lying to somebody. So it's a great place for that. And again, the collars pretty much like this with the alphanumeric code on them. And then once we got them fitted and so forth, we let them go right back on that marsh. We looked at kind of movements on two scales, kind of these large scale wintering complexes, and then within complexes, we looked at kind of sites within those complexes. And so we kind of identified 8 potential complexes out there that we knew just from midwinter surveys and so forth that were kind of existing out there. And a lot of these complexes are kind of tributaries and so forth of each other and in close proximity. So those kind of comprise that complex. So for example, if you were to go to, this is southern Nebraska, which is about 20 miles west of North Platte. What you'll see is Birdwood Creek, which actually is a tributary into the North Platte River. And we did have interchange between Birdwood and North Platte River. So again, it's kind of that complex, and the sites being the North Platte River and or Birdwood Creek. So that was kind of one of those complex sites. We looked at the number of times they used different complexes and sites for each winter. We also did have, again, we didn't capture all the birds were not adult females with cygnets. We actually had some that were failed, or we suspected failed breeders or non-breeders. And we kind of compared the number of complexes each one of those groups used. We looked at kind of the departure times, duration of wintering period from those areas. And again, how much time they spent at those complexes. We looked at fidelity, again, at 2 different scales here. Again, we looked at that large one, if they came back to those same kind of complexes and sites in repeated years, kind of on that scale. But what we also did is we recognized when you're looking at some of these, they're pretty long, so to speak. So we looked at kind of in a way of kind of a home range when they were on those particular wintering complexes, and kind of created a home range, if you will. And we also kind of looked at the specifics of that, but then kind of created this 10-kilometer buffer around there. Again, just trying to capture a little bit of the variation that you would expect of birds moving along. And a good example of kind of what I'm talking about here, this is the Middle Loop River, which runs a pretty good distance, and actually goes even further than this. It splits into like 3 different tributaries. And so a swan, what we were trying to do is, if a swan used the lower part of the Middle Loop one year and kind of the more western or northwestern part of the Middle Loop, we were trying to capture kind of that within complex changes in fidelity. So did they kind of use the Middle Loop River in the same spot as they did the previous year? We were lucky enough to capture 38 swans in about 4 or 5 years there. We had 2 swans that we had to recapture because their transmitters failed or the antenna got pulled off. We did have about half of those were females with cygnets. We had some, again, individuals that we didn't know necessarily 100% sure. We had some that we knew nested but didn't have any cygnets. Some that we believe that were failed breeders, and then some non-breeders. We did have some swans die shortly after capture, which unfortunately we really couldn't determine death on those, and we don't know if that had something to do with capture myopathy or not. And then again, we had some signal loss. Again, probably one thing was we lost a few antennas, it seems like, after those years, so we couldn't get repeated data. But we did have 16 swans that wintered at least in 2 different occasions, and we tracked them through both those years. The first thing we found out is that we actually had, of all these swans, that there was only one bird that actually departed Nebraska and actually went down into Kansas and then down into Oklahoma to winter. And again, this is one of those birds that was probably a non-breeder, and the next following year it did not leave Nebraska. It stayed in the state. We did have 2 swans that actually went back up to La Creek during the winter time, but both of these birds, we caught those within in Nebraska, but just really kind of right across the border. So basically they were staying in Nebraska. And kind of as we suspected, they weren't moving a lot. When you're talking, 53 kilometers, was that 40 miles? That's not a big distance to start moving. Although we did have one bird that went up to 230 kilometers, and I think that was the bird that probably went down to Kansas, Oklahoma. Kind of interesting in the sandhills in terms of when they start departing. What you had is about 40% of these birds, when they departed kind of their breeding areas, so to speak, their initial move was to another big sandhills lake that probably wasn't froze over. And then they went into a wintering complex, and they used about 3 different complexes over the winter, and just about 2 sites within that complex. We did find that those non or failed breeders use more complex than those adults with cygnets. When they got to those spots, they were spending 77% of their time on just one location or one complex, and then the 14% at a different site. So basically they kind of went and stuck at one place, although they did move around a little bit in terms of using those complexes at different times. And again, what we were seeing in these non and failed breeders moving a little bit more than adults with cygnets. One of the things we did find out was these birds actually during the winter period, if it warmed up enough, would actually go back up into the sandhills lakes, which we hadn't really anticipated. Again, mid-November starts freezing up. They come back in March. The kind of wintering period was about 90 days for most swans. One year it was as low as 51 and as high as 129. High fidelity, again, kind of what we anticipated. We had a birds coming in at 72% in terms of fidelity, and all those birds at least came back to their wintering complex all the time. They made at least one stop there. Again, higher fidelity with those birds with cygnets. And again, kind of looking at that home range, again, they're high fidelity to those areas. We kind of grouped up those birds in terms of the fidelity and looking along that with the 10-kilometer buffer. And again, what you're seeing is just a kind of a repeat. They're actually, when they get on those wintering complexes, they're pretty much used in that same area of those wintering complexes that they did the year before. Again, pretty much these birds are going to one location, staying there for the most part during the wintering period, although they do move around a little bit. And when we've seen movements, it did appear to coincide with weather changes, either warm or colder periods. And definitely, if they were starting to come back in the spring, you started seeing a lot more movement up into the sandhills. And again, we anticipated this. We knew that these breeding marshes were close to the wintering areas. And again, we recognize that these failed non-breeders are probably running into adults with cygnets, and probably social dominance is kicking in there at some point with those. One thing I would really like to do is, if I get more time, more money, is start looking at several years of this and following individual cygnets as well as adults. And we all recognize that waterfowl during the winter, they give them open water, give them some food, they can stick there, and that's what we're seeing here. So they really don't have to move very far. Even though there's been suggestions of these birds moving further south, we had one bird that did that. So kind of the migratory tradition is pretty much stays in the sandhills, at least from our study here. So we're not seeing that kind of movement out of the state of Nebraska to other places. And again, high fidelity. But that again has kind of caused some problems, if you will, to some extent with this population, because we have seen low genetic diversity within this flock. And so this high fidelity kind of explains that, or helps explain that. We did find some creeks that I had no idea these birds would use, and how these birds get into some of these creeks, I have no idea. They have got to be really good flyers, because the creeks are no wider than the tables you're sitting at, and they're in there, and I don't know how they do it. Again, use of lakes during the wintering period. Some of these lakes actually have a spring in them that opens up the water, but using those habitats was something we didn't anticipate. And again, I wish we could have got up there, seen who was all up there and what they were doing on those lakes during those periods of time, because it was kind of a shocker for us. Again, all those areas that were terms of wintering areas, complexes, are all going to be important in Nebraska to maintain in the future. And again, with some of the things coming on board in terms of conservation threats, it's going to be a concern. And again, as a researcher, you always got to throw in the slide that I got to do more, so yeah, I got to find out how I can drive 4 or 5 hours every year and get out there and start doing this stuff again. But there is a lot of work in terms of other age groups and stuff that would be beneficial to conservation and management implications. And with that, I'd really appreciate all the landowners that we had access to get on to capture swans. Definitely a lot of people help when you have this sort of thing. And then DeSalle was on a Fulbright. So, and thanks to Game and Parks and Dave Olson for financial support. Thank you.